So my name is Michael Senkow, and I'm a front-end developer, user experience designer within the IBM Design group, specifically working on the Analects platform sub-team. And
I'm Voranouth Supadulya, and I'm a visual and UX designer at IBM Design within the same group.
we're basically going to be going over, in the past year, we've been on this team together since it started, and we've been building this design guide for the Analects platform, in which is this set of components. We're going to be showing some examples from it that hundreds, potentially thousands of developers across the Analects platform are hopefully using. And we're going to be talking about first, what is a design guide in the first place? What do we even mean by this? And like giving some comparisons so you can get in your mindset what exactly we mean for this versus like other sorts of things in the similar realm. Other good examples that you can look towards in this field that other companies have made or are making. And also we're going to be going across ours specifically as a case study, showing what was good about it, what was bad about it, what we learned, and hopefully giving you some tips and tricks in which if your organization or company or subgroup is making a similar sort of design guide, you can learn from the mistakes that we made. And then we'll be getting enough questions. And I'm very big on, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, raise your hand and I can try to jump in and out as quickly as I can. Okay, so first off, I just want to get in the mindset of what we're even talking about. I studied architecture in a school for a little bit before I jumped into human-computer interaction, which got me into UX design. But in architecture, they had these books called Architectural Graphic Standards. And the core idea was that it was something in which, why reinvent the wheel? Like, the human body has a certain set width, door frames are kind of based around that, countertops are based around that. A lot of design ideas that inform architectural design space don't really need to be reinvented again. Zaha Hadid doesn't need to think about how high the counters in her next amorphous blob are going to be. She should be focused on what is the full experience of the building instead. And this is something, like I'm pointing this out just because it's something, the idea of a design guide so that people can focus on other design work isn't new. I mean, these have existed for decades. I have that 6th edition copy that there is from my desk at home, and it's from like 1910 or something like that. Now that same concept did end up getting carried over into software design. Now this I've gathered is a book that was applied more to CS majors. I didn't go down that route, but I've heard it was good in that realm. And the idea was it took that same concept, those patterns that informed architectural design, rather than reinventing the wheel all the time for like a search pattern, closing the application window pattern. People would lay out design patterns within software applications so that you could focus on the larger experience rather than necessarily focusing on the weeds that have been done over and over and over again. Okay. Now, in a slightly different comparison, so these are more pattern library books that have existed in design realms. There's also things such as graphic standards manuals. Specifically here, I'm showing off the NASA Graphic Standards Manual. It made it big in a Kickstarter thing recently where they reprinted it, and then of course NASA released it to the public. So if you ever want to look through this fully, the full PDF showing the beautiful schema of the 1960s NASA program is available for anyone to peruse when they want to. But the idea behind graphic standards manuals is they're a little bit more bent towards marketing and branding. They show things such as what is the font choice for the company, what font weights are we going to actually use, what sizings are adequate for the company, if you have a logo, how do you use it, how should you not use it. For this one, like what are the colors of NASA and which one should you use versus which one are you breaking away from the mold with. Along with, and this was they didn't necessarily have websites, they didn't have apps, but they had pamphlets and magazines and books. And they would show that same sort of grid layout structure. Here's some examples. So that if you're designing an experience for this next NASA building that's opening up, you're not focused around worrying about the grid structure of your pamphlet. You're focused around thinking about the experience of your new setup instead. Okay, so those are kind of like comparative, but not exactly what we ended up building. What we ended up building is a little bit more similar to, say, Apple's human interface guidelines. So I'm mentioning this one specifically because out of the different I'm going to mention a few different interaction software design guidelines. And this one's really nice because it is so open-ended. If you've never read it before, you really should. It's the sort of thing in which if you're working on an iOS application and you do want to mimic the Apple look and feel, it tells you the broader philosophy of Apple products without necessarily focusing you down to the nitty-gritty. It never says, oh, you have to use this font, you have to use this font size, you have to use these colors. Instead, it says broader schema concepts like, this feels like an Apple product, this moves like an Apple product. And it's a good example because it is so open-ended. versus there are other ones out there. So I was looking for one that was less aesthetically pleasing, but Microsoft apparently makes a bunch of medical apps. I didn't even know they had this division. But it's the same sort of idea, only this one when I was looking through it, was a bit more codified. Rather than being the broad look and feel of Microsoft Health interface apps, it was specifically how can you use a search button within a Microsoft Health application? How should you place your navigation toolbars? Things of that nature, things that are a little bit more prescriptive than how Apple laid theirs out. And a few more examples. Well, I did mention that a lot of these, like with the graphic standards, with the architecture standards, a big part of it is that you don't have to recreate the wheel. In a way, it is also good to recreate the wheel. With Windows 8, with their guidelines, they had an entirely new interface construct. I mean, you had tablets before, but you didn't have a full computer experience within a touch interface environment before. And I assume looking through their guidelines, this helped them start thinking through buttons aren't the same anymore. Rather than having buttons, we have this whole card concept that is different from what necessarily would have existed in a mouse interface before. So they're no longer reinventing the wheel. Now they're using kind of the act of reinventing the wheel to reinvent themselves. And last of all, I'm going to actually click through this one. Like, you've probably heard of Google's material design. It's probably the most famous design type guide out there right now. And actually, I'm going to click through the real site if I can. Oops. So theirs is really good because and ours didn't grab this from them. We just happened to do the same thing around the same time. But theirs is the same sort of thing. It's kind of like the graphic standards manuals where you're looking at things such as what is the color of Google's products? What is the typography of Google's products? But also getting into the broader philosophical things such as what does emotion look like? What are specific cards going to look like within the Google product atmosphere? And maybe the Wi-Fi is loading slower than I want. But in many ways, if you look back towards like the NASA graphic standards manuals, I mean, this one's interactive and has navigation and so on, but it's the same thing over again. Like it's a branding, coloring schema of a company, but laid out through code. And that's actually where, and we're gonna mention that with our guide too, but Google's is nicer because along with showing you why did they design a button this way? Why did they design a motion concept this way? Why did they pick these colors? They also do have a nice letting you quickly get into, let's just grab a bunch of components and build something right now. So if they're get MDL set of components, you have a nice little subset where if you wanted something to look like the material design language, you just have to download it right there and you have something up and running within 10 minutes when you don't necessarily want to think about the broader experience and you just want to get something working right then. Okay. And last of all, I'm going to mention, like kind of at the end of the spectrum is things like Bootstrap, where it's just purely a framework, but it is also sort of like what we've been laying out. It's the idea that here they're not telling you why a button looked a certain way. They're just setting out, here's all the different things that make up Bootstrap. And if you want to use them, they're laid out in front of you. They're showing you how they're working, but they're not necessarily even trying to worry about why did this exist in a design scheme in the first place. Okay, so everything I mentioned was other companies' stuff. So this is the sort of thing that we've been doing here at IBM Design. In the last, so I started 3 years ago, and when I started, this didn't exist at all. And it's that same idea once again. They wanted to look through and think, okay, in the new design history of what IBM is going to become, what is the color of IBM? What is the typography of IBM? What is the icon libraries of IBM? And in their design language, and we didn't work on that, we worked on this separate guide thing, but the design language is very open-ended. It's much more, here's the broad look and feel, but we still want, of the thousands of designers working at IBM across the myriad of different products, we don't want them all to look the same, so we want to give this like vaguely structured set of ideas without getting too prescriptive. Which, on one hand, is very nice, but then then you get into the Analects platform subgroup, and you want to get a bit more prescriptive. So this is what we're going to talk about. So in the next few, we're going to talk about the work that we did going into this guide itself, along with what we learned about it. But I want to quickly click through it so you have an understanding of what we're talking about when we discuss some of these different things. So this is the guide that I'm talking about that we've been building. And it differs from the IBM Design language in which it is more prescriptive. Within it, we do talk about things such as our focus, might take slightly longer than I wanted. Well, it talks about things such as our focus. It goes through specific components. We've ended up laying out things, everything from generalized content to like how do you even do phrasing within our applications, to a whole bunch of different specific components, and then taking those components, combining them to secondary steps where they're actual interactions. Okay, that's good that I have other pages open too, so. Yeah. And specifically, like we've done, a lot of the work that went into it was looking through things such as making sure that it was responsive, making sure it worked in multiple environments at the same time, because we didn't know when we were first building it who was going to necessarily be using it and in what different scenarios they would be using it in. Okay, now that you've seen a little bit of the live version, I'm going to go back to static slides a bit. Okay.
All right, so to get to where we are, we had to go through this process, and it was a design process. And I'm going to take you guys through from where we started and how we built up from that foundation. The first thing we started with was branding, and as you know, we needed to figure out who exactly we were. Analytics platform is our team, and what makes our product stand out within that sea of all the blue products that we have. Branding is very important because it paves the way for everything else that comes after it. And for us, we have two audiences. We have the designer developer who's gonna go to our website and they're gonna pick up the tools that we offer and build their product. Then we also have to keep in mind their users, who is like the data scientist or the business analyst who's gonna be using the actual product.
And along with that, like we're hoping for the perfect world where people are using this in a great environment, but we're also realistic. Sometimes there's gonna be developers out there who just, the way the organization works, they don't get any designers to work with them. So we're always trying to make the guide be something that they can quickly and easily grab, even if they don't have as much help as they would like.
Yeah, and after all of the workshops, we knew that we wanted our brand to be about human-to-human experiences. We wanted the analyses and the data to be transparent and very trustworthy. We wanted to give our users that feeling of confidence in making a decision based on the insights of the data. Figuring out what our brand looked like kind of overlapped around the same time we decided what our branding was. And after we decided our portfolio's why, we were then able to connect these 4 foundations of visual design to it. So one of the most difficult decisions was in choosing these colors. As you can see, we're not blue at all, so we definitely stand out compared to everyone else. We had everyone in our team be a part of the research, the color mapping, the workshops, and the whole process in deciding what our colors were gonna be. And here you can see one of our exercises where we mapped to colors based on the y-axis, we have the emotional to functional, and then on the x-axis, we have approachable to powerful. And we also asked our teams to plot where they think they stand within this quadrant.
Yeah, yeah. Because there's a big thing in which, we mentioned in the previous slide, everything within the Analects, IBM Design works across a whole bunch of different products. The Analects platform specifically is usually on big data storage, big data management, things of that nature. So on one hand, you're trying to make something that is classically not friendly. On the other hand, you are also trying to keep it sophisticated and keep that respect that it deserves.
All right. While choosing the colors, we baked in accessibility at the very beginning for color blindness and for color contrast. This is extremely important, especially at IBM, because we want to be inclusive to everyone. And it is a global company, so we have to keep that in mind. It's actually a lot harder than you think to include accessibility at the beginning. But I think it's very important, and it shouldn't just lie with developers. Like, designers should also keep it in mind while they're iterating and exploring. Accessibility has made a lot of great decisions for our team, and yeah.
Well, and that's where I'm specifically going to click through a few examples, because I do want to iterate. That's why it's nice that I had this one open too. So just even looking at buttons, like when we made the original color choices, along with doing that study within the pattern, like how humanistic they are and what their metaphors are behind the color. There also was just simple constraints. There were certain color contrast levels that, as much as we might have liked the way a button looked, it just would have had such low contrast when you're flipping between the hover state and the active state that people wouldn't have been able to read it, and then it would have been accessible, and then we would have gotten in trouble accessibility-wise. Same sort of thing with font sizing. Like, even from the very beginning, we set a basis, I think it was 16 pixels. We've slowly reduced it to 14 because a lot of the applications need more space. But it's the sort of thing in which you can't go too much smaller, because then you're starting to run into, you'll be hurting the ability for people who have visual, varying levels of visual blindness to read your applications in the first place. So it's that interesting thing of which, on one hand, you have the aesthetic of just how it looks in the first place. On the other hand, you have these kind of nice constraints because you're trying to make sure that the experience is good for everyone, because accessibility is something in which it's not just people with disabilities at this moment, it's everyone. As we age, we're going to develop different levels of disabilities, accessibility issues. Any other, oh, and even I want to point out some other things, like along with the color choices and the typography, it also became things such as making sure all the elements were kind of alive, making sure that you knew kind of cognitively if you'd hovered over an element, if you clicked on an element, and if it was going to do an action after that. Had you put in the steps to make sure that people felt like this wasn't just a static thing, that they didn't expect another step to follow it, but did you actually make it feel like a live element? And also within that, so I worked on the UX side, but then on the development side, within accessibility, we had to make sure it was coded right. And that gets into things, some of it's the weird thing of with the guide, we want to be open-ended for everyone. So we do things such as our buttons have a href version, which we know is not as good, but then we have the button version because we know that's better for voiceover and screen reading potentials. We weren't sure which use case scenario would be used the most, but we wanted to make sure it was open-ended for whatever developers used it for in the end.
All right. When choosing our grids and typography, we had to make sure that it was responsive and that our type would also scale while we were scaling whatever the browser was. We realized along the way that visual designers definitely comprehend grids completely different than like a front-end developer, just a developer in general. Sometimes you're just gonna have to like sit down and explain your end of the spectrum to each other, so you have that mutual understanding.
Yeah, I mean, just a side note on that one is just, I think currently we're using this Suzy grid work, which I believe actually Mina Markham, who spoke at this last year, maybe the year before that, is like a big proponent of. And even with that, it's a really great grid system within front-end development. We've started to realize that maybe we should make it more amorphous in just the pure coding side.
All right, after laying down the foundation for our visual design, we began the designs for our UI components. And we looked at what our teams were currently using, and many of them were at the beginning stages, or they were wireframes, so they had it really open-ended for us. We were able to explore. So we just started with basic components like a button, or in this instance, we have here the number input. I would go pretty much to every team and ask them if they had this instant, like if they're using number inputs. And some of them did use it, some of them didn't, some of them used it differently than other people. And so these were all very important for our team in like explaining what the story was gonna be for when we chose our components. And then after that, we explored. And by explorations, I mean a ton of exploration. Like, it not only by me, this is not all my work. This is me and a bunch of the designers on our team who explored the same idea. During this time, user experience and visual design overlapped, and we had to think of the different states that these single components would have, or how they would be within a UI, like where they would fit within the UI. After exploring, we'd come back down to earth. Maybe we'd code some of them up, and then we'd show it to our teams. And I guess analytic platform is consistent of a lot of different teams. Yeah.
And just to reiterate here, like a big part, I'll show the animation. A big part of everything within what we're discussing is the idea of iterative process. And it's a never ending, it's not just you do it once and you do it twice and you loop, but it really is all those examples that we showed there, we eventually settled on one or two of the number inputs that are they're the most practical, they're the most logical for everyday uses. But we didn't throw away the rest. The rest are living in a nice folder set system that maybe we're gonna come back to an application someday that needs the more complex or interesting or creative number input to be that much sparklier. And this is what we mean. So along with the visual designers creating iterative steps through their process, I get to sometimes come in as a coder and be like, hey, so you're working on hover states. Let me mock up 4 different variations of the hover state and the active state in this new card list view that you're looking for, and throw them in front of you and see if any of them look interesting. Like I specifically want to show. Like this is what I was working on last week, where it was, hey, we're thinking of this. Well, what is the active state? What is the hover state? What is the mild animation that you're seeing there? Is it going to be practical? Is it going to be slightly more fun where it's growing out of a line? Are we going to try to do something weird with 3D elements? And we decided that was a bit too odd. And even are you going to do something crazy where like maybe the dots almost seem slightly alive? And they're really small, minimal elements, but it's the sort of thing where it's a nice point where the front-end developers get to have as much fun as the visual designers do for that creative, iterative process. And this one's, yeah, we threw this one in because we want to kind of harken back to the accessibility thing I was mentioning along with the iterative process. So sliders are a great example that we've built in which the original version when we laid it out there was very simplistic. There wasn't much going on, there was just the handlebar and the line. And then we got the input, well, we need to have the number because we need to know exactly what the specific number is and we don't know where that might be living elsewhere on the screen. So we need it coded with the component itself, not only just for visual purposes, but also for accessibility. But then we originally had it like kind of in the bottom left corner of the slider. But then when people actually started putting their application, and we realized, oh, that's taking up too much vertical space, and it eventually settled into the thing that you see on the right, where it's much more purely horizontal. It has each of the 3 primary numbers that could then easily be read for voiceover, along with various versions of it, where the number is always visible or only sometimes visible, has 2, whether it's a range or just a single slider. So it's kind of getting back into the how, through actual use cases, we iterated both visually and through code. Oh, and this is, like, I grabbed this from patternlab.io. We didn't specifically look at this when we were designing everything, but then looking back at it, we kind of did. Like, everything that we were building ended up being kind of atomic components that then combined into molecular interactions. We're currently working more onto a set of templates that would be larger, like here's a base blog, here's a base number application. And that's what they're just combinations of those smaller subcomponents grouped into larger ones and larger ones and larger ones.
All right, so not only did we design our components, but we also designed the actual style guide itself with our users in mind. So we have a lot of information and they're geared towards designers and developers, but sometimes developers that we work with, they don't have a team of designers, so we had to make sure that our guide is able to be comprehended by them also. So let's see, we started here, we went through another, design process, and here we have the basic wireframes, but we didn't follow this, but it was like an idea of where we started, and we led with content, which is very important. We went through some iterations and of what our website could look like, and of course we went with the one on the right. Yes, but it was really fun to just explore what we could have been. And here is the first release of our style guide. As you can see, we don't have very much content at the time, and we realized that this wasn't going to be able to grow into what we wanted it to be. It wasn't going to hold everything that we were going to become.
And you can also see somewhat in the layout, when we were at this stage in the site, we hadn't started thinking about the fact that there's going to be components and interactions. Things were grouped more into data experience and visual guide. It wasn't the same sort of iterative step-by-step design that we did eventually settle on. And another big part of this is, even at this point, we had started to code it out, because that was really key. If we had kept it in static versions of this, we wouldn't have seen the navigation issues we were going to run into. We wouldn't have seen the layout issues, and we wouldn't have started to explore the templating and other codified aspects that made the current guide so much easier to work with.
And so we changed our navigation a few times, and the image on the right is closer to where we are now. So as you can see, content was a huge factor in why we made these changes.
Yeah, I mean, early versions, The navigation took up much more of the screen. It was kind of obtrusive. It kind of had this page effect that was almost like the old, if you remember the old way Facebook used to work, where pages would slide in. Now it's kind of more the way most of Google applications work, where there's the hamburger menu. It slides in or out, but it lets you focus on one specific section. Because we got a lot of feedback from people using the guide. They weren't switching between a lot of pages all at once. They were usually like going to one page and looking at that for a while, and then going to another one. So they really wanted to focus in on one section rather than necessarily quickly flipping between different sections.
Not only did we design our style guide, but we also designed our downloadable assets. And although I don't have an image of this up on this screen, I wanted to tell you guys that our filing system and folder naming system is extremely organized. I feel like that's really important if you're going to start building your own style guide, because you're going to have people in different disciplines, you know, at the same place looking for the similar files, and it's really easy to be able to refer them to this file and they'll know exactly how to get there because that filing system is so organized. Also, within the downloadable assets, for instance, you know, Illustrator and Photoshop, we have organized everything by layers, and we also clean up and reorganize the artboard files. So say, you know, the colors are in the coloring layer, the red lines are in the red line layers, the design is in the design layer, everything's locked, and the artboards are organized in the correct order that they're displayed in. I don't know about if you guys have ever worked with designers, but if you've ever looked in their files and they design completely different than you, it is a complete like headache. It's it's very frustrating. So when you give people these layers within these, you know, everything's the same, then they'll know exactly what to look for.
Yeah. And that sort of gets into the pleasant thing. The next one is, along with the visual assets, so you like she was saying, you have color files for Photoshop and Illustrator. We also ended up doing a lot of coded aspects. When we first started working on the guide, I pushed for the idea of like having buttons not just be, I wanted to have a button that wasn't just a visual button or even like a GIF or something like that, but we wanted to actually have interactive buttons. And at first they were just meant to be prototypes that you could like look at them and see, oh, this is the active state, this is the hover state. But then we realized, oh, well, we're actually building it, we're making the correct codified version. Let's actually start to make a set of downloadable components that people can work through and use. So as we work through the guide, that initial subset of like prototype buttons and sliders and drop downs became this other, along with the guide itself, this other set of AP components in which people can just download and connect to a set of CSS files, a set of JavaScript files, and the base HTML markup, and get all the typography that we're trying to get people to use, all the different buttons and href links that we're trying to get people to use. And they don't have to rethink. They can look at the guide to understand where it came from and why we made these color choices and why we made these transition choices. But they also can just easily, quickly, and grab these components for themselves. Yeah, and I mean through that, just like as showing off like or explaining a little bit of that process. When we first started, we didn't have the GitHub connection, but happily that happened fairly quickly. Everything that we're doing ended up being organized through basic GitHub files, and we ended up using ZenHub for the actual like keeping track of issues and task control. Like earlier we used Trello when we first started, which mostly worked, yeah. But it was really nice, like a lot of what we've been saying is that the visual and UX designers and the front-end developers were never separated. We all worked cohesively with each other, and with ZenHub that became that much better. So if Voranouth sees an issue with something that she can change, she can jump into the code and actually make content or color or download or basic issues. If it's more substantial, like this transition on a dropdown is totally messed up for some reason, then she can make an issue for me on ZenHub, point it out to me, and I can go fix it. But along with those just like basic bug issues, we're also still keeping track of the broader, where are we going? What's the next thing we're gonna be working on? What are the things we're forgetting about? Does accessibility on this one component need to be improved? Oh yeah, and just also to throw out there, just from the beginning, we were using, is another interesting thing of the whole iterative process of this. When we first started, I'd love to say we did a bunch of research and everything was easy as pie from the beginning. Instead, we slowly discovered, okay, SAS was better than less, and more of the people in the organization supported, so let's go with the SAS method for using CSS. We tried a few different templating things and eventually settled on Nunjux because there was a better one, I can't remember its name, but it stopped being supported, so Nunjux was the most optimal one. And then basically whatever tools we can use that make life easier, we've been using. So Gulp to make sure that when we're doing visual design through CSS, it quickly and auto updates, an auto prefixer, because our stuff still works best in Chrome on a Windows computer, but we're making sure to get it as optimal as possible on everything back to like Windows XP running Internet Explorer 6 if we have to. Oh yeah, okay.
All right. So our team, if you guys didn't know, I don't know if I mentioned, our team started off pretty much brand new. For some of us, most of us, except for Michael, it was our first day on the job. And for me, it was my first job really out of college. So we did learn a lot of stuff. And here are some lessons learned from our team, and we want to share it with you guys. So our first lesson comes from our lead front-end developer named Allison Joseph, and she said, close collaboration between disciplines will ensure better results. And this is, again and again, very, very true. We have to explain our thought process to each other because we don't see things the same way, and it's like we don't speak the same language even though we're working in the same company.
Right. I mean, it gets into things like, I think to a specific example, we changed, in our early guide, we were showing all of our font sizing with points, because in graphic design world, points make the most sense, and in Illustrator, that's okay. But then when you transpose that over to the web, you get some interesting issues where the points don't totally match exactly. So as soon as we realized this and it made more sense from the development side, and since they were such a big part of our audience, we got all the visual UX side to just agree, let's do everything in pixels, even if aesthetically or from your background you prefer to think in the point realm. It will make more sense for the core audience of this guide in the end.
From our lead visual designer, Andrew Smith, our second lesson comes where he says, design for the experience and not for the interaction or the component. Say you can design a bike pedal or a bike seat, but what you really need to be designing for is that wheelie that person's gonna do through the canyon. And so design for that experience. Don't just design the component. You're not really gonna know how people are gonna use that component.
I mean, this gets into so I showed the guide itself and then also that separate set of AP components laid out in one page. By having those all next to each other, we've been able to quickly and easily, we haven't yet laid out what our motion philosophy is, but we kind of have one. We have this whole sliding thing going on where all of our tabs slide in and out. All of our menu items have a slide up and down thing. And it ended up being something in which, rather than doing totally different motions for every single component, all of the components have a very similar philosophy in their motion design, even though we hadn't necessarily laid that out yet.
Lesson 3 comes from Ruben Fernandez, who is our UX and visual designer, and he says, always consider the worst case scenarios. When you think you've laid it out as most detailed as you can, and consider the worst case scenario. You're not gonna know, like I said, how people are gonna use this, but it's better to think about 3 or 4 steps ahead of time before you're gonna have to run into it anyway. So I think that's also something that we learned. For instance, when Ruben was designing our cards, he thought about the type layout and he thought about how people were interacting with it, et cetera, but then all of a sudden, something as simple as a very long name, like my own name, could have broken this, and he had to go back and rethink of these things, because we also work with Germany, and German words are a lot longer than English words.
Yeah, I mean, and it kind of gets into the guide itself, the fact that really we don't have a lot of proof that people are viewing this on their phone, but as the front-end developers in the group, we're making sure it's coded to work on everything from a tiny little iPhone 4 to a full desktop computer, because we're hoping to find out through actually codifying it that way that maybe people might have that use case scenario. But if we don't do that in the first place through our work, then we won't have the chance to discover that in the end. And it doesn't take that much more effort to code things responsibly.
Lesson 4 comes from Jennifer Kang, who is a UX and visual designer, also used to be on our team. She says, it's okay to explore outside of the box, our guide, and to also take risks. Because if we don't push the envelope and try new things, or we just copy from Google material, then how are we gonna be able to innovate? How are we gonna change. We're not gonna know. We can't just let what we've created, which is the guide, hold us back from what we could possibly be.
I mean, it's kind of like I mentioned the different weird motion design concepts that were laid out. Every time we do something, we always try to do a bunch more design constructs that are not necessarily going to get used, but we never know, and it might be something in the future might work better for an application that we just haven't envisioned yet. Oh, the next one's me. This one's for me. Until you see something living, you don't really understand it. I like to think of myself as a UX product designer, but at the same time, I really love code, and I'm a big proponent of until you've seen it living, you really don't understand it. Until you've clicked into it, and you've made it responsive, and you've put it on 3 different devices, and tried to break it as many ways as you can, you're not going to know if that component that you designed really does make sense, or maybe it actually only made sense on your big, giant desktop computer.
Yeah, that's true. And then the last one is from me, Voranouth, in case you've forgotten how to pronounce that. The style guide is organic and it's meant to be broken, and that's okay. We expect our style guide to be broken. We want it to be broken, and that's what makes us better. I didn't know a lot of things coming into the software realm for the first time, and so I kind of just learned it along the way. I made it. We adapted to the situations, and whatever was wrong, we made it right, or as right as we could make it. And I'm gonna give you guys an example. When I first got on the job, my first thing I had to design was the grid. So we picked this 12-column grid, and I had margins on both sides. Well, I didn't know it was gonna be broken until somebody came up and said, hey, I'm gonna flush this design to the edge, and I can't do that with your grid. So pretty much it was already live on the site. So I was like, well, we did not think about that. So I had to go back and, make our grid more flexible and be able to, have people be able to flush to the edge if they wanted to.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big thing. Everything we've laid out, and that's, I think with any guide, that should be key. It's not set in stone. If someone says they want to use bright, burnt sienna orange on their application instead of magenta and teal, they can. They have to have a good reason, and they have to give us, it can't just be random, but nothing we've laid out there is meant to be the cold hard truth of how an application has to get made.